Marriage in ancient Rome was never the tender, romantic affair we like to imagine when we picture white togas fluttering in the breeze or couples exchanging eternal vows beneath marble columns. No, the Romans would laugh at such notions, or perhaps sneer, depending on how much wine they'd had. For them, the union of two individuals was not about love or even personal happiness. It was about politics, alliances, property, and above all, power. To marry in Rome was less like stepping into a lifelong story of devotion and more like signing a contract under the watchful eyes of your ancestors. If modern marriage is often seen as a declaration of love, in Rome it was a declaration of strategy. The cold truth is that Roman families treated marriage the way modern corporations treat mergers. Who brought the most land to the table? Whose name carried more weight in the Senate? Who could offer connections to a governor, a consul, or perhaps a general on the rise? These were the questions that really mattered. A daughter wasn't simply a bride. She was an investment, a piece on the vast chessboard of Roman society. Sons weren't immune either. While they might enjoy more freedom, their marriages were still tools to advance family interests. To marry without considering these stakes was not only foolish but potentially disastrous to a family's standing. The ceremony itself, stripped of its rhetoric, resembled a performance of loyalty to tradition rather than a declaration of personal attachment. Families negotiated, arranged dowries, and signed agreements that ensured wealth and property flowed in the right direction. The bride was handed over, quite literally, from one family to another. She didn't belong to her husband in the sense of romantic possession. She belonged to his lineage, his ancestors, his political future. Her role was to produce heirs, cement alliances, and maintain the facade of respectability. Whether she loved her husband, or even liked him, was irrelevant. For the Roman man, marriage provided legitimacy and a public front, but the expectation of romantic fidelity was laughable. Affairs were not only tolerated, but often encouraged as markers of status. A man might pursue courtesans, mistresses, or even relationships with other men, and as long as he maintained his dominant, masculine role, society shrugged. His wife, meanwhile, was expected to maintain her chastity and loyalty, a one-sided arrangement that perfectly illustrated the imbalance of Roman social order. To modern eyes, it seems hypocritical, but to Romans, it was the natural order of things. So when we think of Roman marriage, we must strip away the modern lens of candlelit romance and see it for what it was, a transaction, a contract, a political maneuver dressed up with rituals and feasts. Love could exist. Rome was not devoid of passion, but it was secondary, sometimes even inconvenient. The Romans didn't marry for love. They loved where they could and married where they must. To them, marriage was not a union of souls but an alliance of legacies, and in that cold calculation lies the very essence of Roman society. In ancient Rome, fidelity was not the shining jewel of matrimony, but rather an outdated trinket no one cared to polish. Because let's be honest, if you were a respectable Roman man, people didn't expect you to be faithful. They expected you to be busy, preferably in public, juggling mistresses, courtesans, or perhaps a handsome young protege. And no one would raise an eyebrow except maybe to ask how you managed your schedule. The shocking part is that this was not a scandal. This was the cultural norm, an accepted, almost celebrated perk of Roman masculinity, as natural as pouring another cup of wine at a banquet, while your wife dutifully stayed home, maintaining the household in her chastity like a well-polished statue, a living emblem of fidelity that her husband was never required to embody. After all, loyalty was for dogs, not for senators or generals who strutted through the forum with the scent of perfume not belonging to their wives clinging to their togas. And it wasn't whispered about in the shadows like some shameful secret. It was practically flaunted, an unspoken badge of honor that showed a man had both the charm and the resources to indulge. Courtesans themselves were celebrities of a sort, known for wit, beauty, and refinement, often more stimulating companions than the women waiting at home. And it was perfectly acceptable for men to parade them in public, to dine with them, to laugh with them, to weave them into the social fabric of their lives, because Roman society had made peace with the idea that marriage was a contract, not a romance, and romance, when it came, was better had outside of it. where it couldn't threaten the tidy arrangement of alliances, dowries, and heirs. What strikes modern readers as hypocrisy was, to the Romans, a sensible division of labor. Wives were for lineage and respectability, lovers were for pleasure and passion, and the two worlds rarely collided, unless, of course, a particularly jealous wife decided to make a scene, which sometimes happened but never truly damaged the man's reputation, because his behavior was not considered immoral, only inconvenient. This double standard reveals a world that prized power and appearances over emotional ideals, where a man's extramarital affairs were tolerated, even applauded, as long as he played his dominant role correctly and avoided slipping into anything that smelled of weakness, femininity, or submission, for the real sin in Roman culture was not desire, but losing control. And so fidelity was never the backbone of Roman marriage. It was the least of anyone's concerns, because the public understood the arrangement perfectly well. A man's duty was to his career, his family legacy, and his public image, and as long as those remained intact, his private passions were his own playground, a theater of indulgence in which he could cast himself as lover, conqueror, or patron, while the wife smiled politely at banquets, aware of the game but unable to change its rules, because those rules were written in the very DNA of Roman society, where power, not love, defined the boundaries of respectability. And so the myth of faithful Roman husbands collapses under the weight of historical reality, revealing instead a culture where infidelity was less a vice and more a virtue of masculine life. In ancient Rome, the scandal was never that two men shared a bed. It was whether one of them had the audacity to let himself be seen as the weaker half, because Romans, ever obsessed with power, didn't sort love affairs into neat modern boxes of gay or straight. They sorted them into dominant or submissive, active or passive, the conqueror and the conquered. And if you were a respected Roman citizen, the kind who strutted down the forum in a spotless toga with a retinue of clients trailing behind, you could take lovers of any gender without a hint of shame, as long as you remembered to play the role of the commanding partner, because masculinity in Rome was not about whom you desired, but about how you conducted that desire. And the moment you slipped into the receptive role, especially as a grown man, whispers would follow you faster than a slave chasing spilled wine. Whispers that you had traded your honor for pleasure, that you had surrendered your masculine dignity to behave like a woman, a charge more damning than adultery, theft, or even treason in the social imagination of your peers. And yet irony abounds, because some of the most powerful figures in Roman history were rumored to have enjoyed precisely that role, with none other than Julius Caesar himself mocked in political graffiti as the Queen of Bithynia for allegedly submitting to King Nicomedes, proof that while society loved to moralize about roles, in practice it tolerated far more than it admitted, provided you could still crush enemies on the battlefield and bribe senators into line. And what makes it all so fascinating is that this so-called tolerance wasn't hidden or whispered about in shame. It was woven into the very texture of Roman life, where men openly took younger partners, often in relationships styled as mentorship, teaching them rhetoric by day and more private lessons by night, and the society applauded the arrangement so long as it followed the proper script of age, power, and dominance, a script borrowed from Greek pederasty and repackaged with Roman pragmatism, because Rome, unlike Greece, was less interested in philosophy about love and more in the performance of authority, and so long as the social pyramid stayed upright, no one cared what happened behind villa doors. The idea of love as identity simply didn't exist, and Romans would have laughed at our 21st century obsession with labels, preferring instead to tally who was in charge, who was giving, and who was receiving. Because in a society addicted to hierarchy, even intimacy became another battlefield where roles had to be performed. And yet, the irony is sharp. Because while Roman men jeered at the adult male who chose the passive role, they exalted emperors who played with boundaries, adored Hadrian for elevating Antinous to divine status, and tolerated Nero's circus of same-sex marriages as long as he remembered, at least sometimes, to wear the toga of dominance, which shows that in the end, Rome's morality was less about what you did in bed and more about whether your actions made you look powerful. Because for Romans, power was always the ultimate aphrodisiac. In Rome, the true scandal was not that men took lovers outside of marriage. Everyone knew that was as routine as bathing in the public thermae, but that an adult male dared to assume the passive role in bed, because nothing horrified Roman sensibilities more than a man surrendering his hard-won dignity to play the part they reserved for women, slaves, and foreigners. The passive role was branded as effeminate, a betrayal of the ironclad performance of masculinity that defined every senator, general, or ambitious citizen who hoped to climb the rungs of Roman power. And while our modern ears might laugh at such rigid thinking, the Romans were deadly serious, whispering in the Forum about grown men who were pathics, syneti, or soft, insults that cut far deeper than any accusation of adultery or corruption, because they undermined a man's claim to authority. This obsession with roles made intimacy not about love, but about hierarchy, about who gave and who received, about who controlled and who surrendered, and the shame attached to the passive partner was so ingrained that even the slightest suspicion could dog a man's reputation for life, as it did with Julius Caesar, mocked mercilessly as every woman's man and every man's woman for allegedly yielding to the king of Bithynia, a smear campaign that haunted him in every debate, cartoon, and tavern joke, proving that in Rome you could conquer Gaul but still lose face if someone suggested you bent the wrong way in bed. And yet the hypocrisy was staggering, because while adult passivity was taboo, relationships with younger boys were not only tolerated, but dressed up as mentorship, where the older partner was the noble guide and the younger the willing student, a tidy little loophole that let the system indulge desire while pretending to preserve dignity. And let's not forget the emperors who bent the rules entirely, like Nero, who married men publicly, or Hadrian, who adored Antinous so openly that he deified him after his death, bending Roman custom into something unrecognizable, yet somehow still cloaked in the language of power and dominance. Still, for the ordinary Roman man, the message was brutally clear. Take what you want, sleep with whom you like, but never ever be seen as the one who submits, because submission was political death, the symbolic stripping of your manhood, and in a society that equated virility with authority, that was the one role you could never afford to play. It was less about private pleasure and more about public performance, a reminder that in Rome, every bed was a stage and every act was scrutinized for what it revealed about status, control, and the endless theater of power. In the grand theater of Roman society, where every action was weighed against the scales of power and reputation, one of the most curious imports from Greece was the practice of pederasty, rebranded and reshaped to suit the pragmatic Roman appetite. And while the Greeks could wax poetic about love between an older man and a youth as the highest form of intellectual and spiritual connection, the Romans were far less sentimental and far more utilitarian, treating such relationships as a kind of mentorship program with benefits. The older partner, the so-called Erastes, wasn't just offering companionship or passion, he was offering a political education, connections, rhetorical training, and a glimpse into the inner machinery of Roman ambition, while the younger partner, the Eromenos, played the role of student, sponge, and occasional ornament, receiving the sort of guidance that might catapult him into the elite circles of Roman power if he played his role correctly. It is tempting to imagine this dynamic as scandalous or secret, but the irony is that it was neither, because Roman society, ever obsessed with hierarchy, understood these pairings as extensions of the same dominance, submission logic that governed every other relationship. And so long as the older man was firmly in control, no one batted an eye. In fact, some families might even encourage such connections if they promised advancement. The beauty of the Greek ideal was stripped away and replaced with Roman realism, where intimacy was bundled neatly with apprenticeship, as though a young man's body and mind were both fields to be cultivated by a superior hand. And what shocks us today is how openly this was acknowledged, written about, and even celebrated in certain circles, not for love's sake, but for the orderly reproduction of Roman values. Yet hypocrisy was never far behind, because while such relationships were tolerated when the younger partner was still in his teens, they were quickly condemned once he matured, since remaining in the receptive role into adulthood carried the dreaded stigma of effeminacy. a charge that could ruin a man's career faster than losing an army in Gaul. Thus, the mentorship had an expiration date, and when the youth became a man, he was expected to step into the role of dominator himself, taking a wife for lineage and perhaps a student lover of his own, perpetuating the cycle like a well-oiled social machine. The Romans, masters of contradiction, managed to present this arrangement as both morally questionable and socially useful, condemning it in rhetoric while practicing it in reality, especially among the elite, where whispered rumors about who mentored whom circulated alongside debates about grain supply and senatorial decrees. The story of Roman pederasty, then, is not one of secret passion hidden in the shadows, but of institutionalized intimacy hiding in plain sight, dressed up as education, legitimized as character building, and tolerated so long as it reinforced rather than threatened the relentless hierarchy that structured every inch of Roman life, from the Senate chamber to the marriage bed. Julius Caesar, the man who could stare down barbarian hordes and bend the entire Roman Republic to his will, was somehow undone not by swords or daggers, but by whispers, graffiti, and a deliciously scandalous rumor that he had once played the submissive role in a liaison with King Nicomedes of Bithynia, and in Rome, where reputation was currency and masculinity was defined less by battlefield triumphs and more by what position you took behind closed doors. This single accusation clung to Caesar like a burr to a toga, fueling decades of ridicule that not even his conquest of Gaul could shake. His enemies, from Cato to Cicero, pounced on the gossip with glee, calling him the Queen of Bithynia, mocking him in speeches, songs, and crude sketches scribbled on walls, because in a society that tolerated affairs, mistresses, and even male lovers, what it could not forgive was a man of high station being seen as the passive partner, for that was a role reserved for women, slaves, or defeated enemies. And Caesar, for all his brilliance, was never able to outrun the joke, a fact that reveals the Roman obsession not with who you loved, but with how you performed that love. The irony is rich, because here was a man who toppled political rivals with his rhetoric, who marched legions across the Rhine and into Britannia, who paraded a nation's worth of spoils through Rome in his triumphs. Yet what his opponents really wanted to discuss was whether he had once bent his imperial dignity in the bedchamber of a foreign monarch, a reminder that in the gladiatorial arena of Roman politics, no sword was sharper than scandal. And Caesar's story shows how personal attacks were woven seamlessly into public discourse, how Roman senators, unable to stop his rise with logic or law, reached instead for the weapons of mockery, innuendo, and sexual slander, knowing that in a culture obsessed with control and dominance, to paint a man as submissive was to weaken him more effectively than a lost campaign. And yet, despite all this, Caesar wore the slur with a curious resilience, never denying it outright, but never allowing it to define him either, countering with achievements so overwhelming that even the sharpest jeers seemed petty in the face of his triumphs. And perhaps this is why the rumor endured, because the very dissonance of it, the idea that Rome's most commanding figure could also be its most mocked, was too delicious to let die. It was repeated in taverns, carved into satire, embedded in speeches, a permanent footnote to his otherwise monumental career. And even when he declared himself dictator for life, when his likeness adorned coins and his word carried the weight of law, the shadow of Nicomedes still lingered, proof that no matter how high a Roman climbed, the tiniest crack in the facade of masculinity could be exploited, exaggerated, and weaponized. So while Caesar may be remembered for crossing the Rubicon and rewriting the fate of Rome, his contemporaries delighted in reminding him that history, like politics, was always as much about perception as power, and that even the greatest general could be undone, at least in reputation, by a well-aimed rumor whispered in the right ear. When it comes to love stories in ancient Rome, few shine brighter or stranger than that of Emperor Hadrian and his beloved Antinous, a tale that reads less like history and more like opera, dripping with drama, devotion, and a flair for the divine, because here was an emperor, married as politics demanded, yet wholly uninterested in his official wife, instead pouring his passion and energy into a relationship with a young man whose beauty and charm captured not only Hadrian's heart, but ultimately the imagination of the entire empire. And in a society where personal bonds were supposed to be secondary to politics, Hadrian shattered convention by turning his grief into a state project when tragedy struck and Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile, whether by accident, sacrifice, or some darker plot, we will never know. But the emperor's reaction was nothing short of astounding, for rather than mourn quietly, as most Romans would have expected, he staged a cultural revolution of remembrance, elevating his lost companion not merely as a memory, but as a god, commissioning statues, temples, and even an entire city named Antinopolis to enshrine his presence forever. A move so unprecedented that it baffled contemporaries who had never seen an emperor immortalize a lover with such extravagance, and the sheer audacity of it forces us to reconsider Roman values. Because while most emperors busied themselves with military campaigns, grain supplies, and gladiatorial games, Hadrian chose to wage war against mortality itself by chiseling Antinous into marble and minting his face into coins, ensuring that his youth and beauty would outlast the empire itself. The irony, of course, is that in Rome, where love was supposed to be transactional and discreet, Hadrian's devotion was neither. It was ostentatious and unapologetic, a public spectacle that blurred the line between private passion and imperial propaganda, leaving future historians to wonder whether this was an act of grief-stricken madness or genius-level statecraft. Because by deifying Antinous, Hadrian simultaneously indulged his sorrow and tied his personal story into the fabric of Roman religion, effectively demanding that his subjects share in his mourning by worshiping the boy as divine. And the worship spread astonishingly fast from Greece to Asia Minor to the very heart of Rome, with shrines and cults sprouting like wildfire, a testament not just to Hadrian's power, but to the allure of the narrative he spun, of a beautiful youth cut down in his prime and resurrected through imperial will. Skeptics, of course, muttered about impropriety, about how unbecoming it was for an emperor to wear his heart on his sleeve, but such grumbling was drowned beneath the tide of art, coins, and ritual that enshrined Antinous as one of the few mortals ever to be granted godhood, a distinction so rare that it outshines even the pomp of triumphal arches and military parades. And so we are left with the image of Hadrian, ruler of a vast empire, standing not as a conqueror, but as a grieving lover who remade the cultural landscape of Rome in the image of his loss, proving that in the end, power in Rome was not only about legions and law, but also about who you dared to love and how loudly you chose to declare it. When we think of emperors, we imagine towering figures cloaked in authority, men too busy ruling the world to bother with personal scandal. But Nero, ever the performer, proved that an emperor could command armies and stages alike, and nothing shocked Rome more than when he decided not once but twice to marry men, each time rewriting the script of power and masculinity in ways that made senators choke on their wine. Because in the first case, Nero wedded his freedman Pythagoras in a full ceremony with all the pomp of a traditional marriage, only this time with the emperor himself, playing the bride veil and all, an image so scandalous that it became the gossip of every bathhouse and banquet. For how could the very symbol of Roman dominance, the princeps, the arbiter of law and life, don the trappings of submission and femininity in front of the world? And yet, he did it, parading the union with theatrical bravado as if daring the public to laugh, which of course they did. But they also watched, fascinated, because Nero's reign was nothing if not spectacle, part politics, part circus, and entirely unpredictable. Then came his second same-sex marriage, this time to a young slave named Sporus. But Nero learned from the outrage of his bridal role and chose instead to be the groom, forcing Sporus into the role of bride, complete with a castration that blurred lines between cruelty and pageantry, an act as grotesque as it was calculated, designed not simply for personal satisfaction, but to maintain the illusion of traditional gendered dynamics in a union that already defied convention. And here lies the irony. For while Roman society tolerated affairs, mistresses, and even relationships between men as long as roles were respected, Nero's flamboyant public weddings were another matter entirely, because they dragged what should have been private indulgence onto the stage of empire, turning imperial intimacy into political theater. And yet, it was vintage Nero, the emperor who fancied himself an artist first and a ruler second, who played the lyre while Rome burned, who craved the attention of the masses whether they adored or despised him. And so in these marriages, we see less of a radical reformer and more of a showman addicted to shock value, a man who understood that scandal was itself a form of power, keeping the Senate off balance and the people talking. Critics and historians alike painted these unions as grotesque parodies of Roman virtue, evidence of Nero's madness, decadence, and unsuitability to rule. But they also reveal the fault lines in Roman culture, where the rigid expectations of masculinity and dominance collided with the messy reality of human desire and political theater. In the end, Nero's same-sex weddings tell us less about love and more about performance, about how an emperor could bend even marriage into a stage prop for his endless drama, and about how, for all their hypocrisy, Romans were simultaneously scandalized and enthralled, unable to look away from the emperor who dared to dress as a bride one day and as a tyrant the next. When it comes to imperial excess, nothing illustrates the grotesque intersection of passion and power quite like Nero's treatment of Sporus, the young boy whom he not only took as a lover, but quite literally reshaped into a theatrical prop for his political and personal fantasies, because in one of the most chilling episodes of Roman decadence, Nero ordered the boy to be castrated, an act that was not about love or intimacy, but about control, a calculated mutilation designed to turn Sporus into a living stand-in for the role of wife in a relationship that would otherwise scandalize Roman sensibilities. And the sheer audacity of this move reveals the paradox of Nero's reign. For while Roman society tolerated same-sex relationships as long as power roles were observed, Nero, ever the showman, wanted more. He wanted the spectacle of a traditional marriage, processions, vows, veils, and all. Yet he also wanted his partner to be male, and so, with the brutality of imperial authority, he made reality conform to his performance, blurring the line between personal indulgence and public theater in a way that horrified even jaded Romans. Sources describe how Sporus was dressed as a bride, paraded before the people, and formally married to the emperor in ceremonies that imitated every detail of Roman matrimony. A grotesque pantomime that simultaneously mocked tradition and reinforced Nero's ability to bend it. And it is here that the irony becomes sharpest, because while Romans could stomach infidelity, affairs, and even unusual liaisons behind closed doors, what they could not tolerate was the emperor dragging private excess into public ritual, forcing society to participate in his masquerade. Nero's marriage to Sporus was not the hidden indulgence of a man pursuing forbidden desire. It was a deliberate performance, staged on the grandest possible scale, with the emperor himself cast as groom and his unwilling partner reduced to a symbol, a human prop designed to calm Roman discomfort by wearing the mask of femininity. And yet even this disguise could not hide the cruelty at its core, for Sporus, a boy robbed of agency and altered for the sake of imperial whim, stands as a haunting reminder of how unchecked power could transform personal obsession into state ritual, and how one man's appetite could rewrite, however temporarily, the social script of an empire. Historians writing of Nero's excesses seized upon this act as proof of his madness, his corruption, his disregard for Roman mores. But it is equally a story of Rome itself, of how a society obsessed with dominance and appearances created the conditions for such a performance to occur, because in a world where masculinity was measured by control and submission was equated with humiliation, Nero's castration of Sporus became the ultimate expression of his authority, a gruesome way to maintain the fiction of tradition while indulging his theatrical flair. And so the story survives, half tragedy, half farce, an anecdote used for centuries to epitomize the depravity of a ruler who mistook cruelty for creativity, and whose legacy is less about the fires of Rome and more about the way he set ablaze the very boundaries between private passion and public spectacle. When it comes to imperial slander, nothing quite rivals the juicy, sordid rumor that Nero shared an incestuous relationship with his mother Agrippina the Younger, a tale so scandalous that it has outlived the empire itself, whispered in every history classroom and footnote as though it were fact, when in reality it was almost certainly the most effective political smear of its time, because in Rome, where reputation was everything and emperors were as much symbols as sovereigns, the surest way to tear one down was to accuse him of violating the most sacred boundaries, and nothing violated Roman sensibilities more than incest, a taboo so absolute that even the suggestion of it could ruin a man. The story was first given shape by Suetonius and Tacitus, historians who laced their accounts with gossip and moral judgment, reporting with varying degrees of coyness that Agrippina may have seduced her son to keep control after he came to power, a claim so outrageous that even they seemed to hesitate. Yet they recorded it anyway, because in the cutthroat politics of imperial Rome, the truth mattered less than the effect. And what better way to paint Nero as unfit for rule than to brand him a man who not only killed his mother, but bedded her too? Whether true or not, and modern historians are nearly unanimous that it was not, the rumor was weaponized relentlessly by Nero's enemies, feeding into an already rich narrative of his supposed debauchery, cruelty, and moral collapse, making him the perfect scapegoat for everything from Rome's decline to the Great Fire. And the irony is that this kind of accusation was not unique to Nero, for Roman political culture thrived on scandal, tossing out charges of adultery, effeminacy, and incest like coins to the mob, because nothing was more effective at reshaping public perception than attacking a man's private virtue or lack thereof. And in Nero's case, the incest rumor stuck so well because it fit the theatrical persona already ascribed to him, the emperor who married men, who performed on stage, who blurred every line of Roman decorum. So why not this line too? The brilliance of the smear lies in its ambiguity, for it was never proven, never openly defended, but simply whispered, recorded, passed along, so that centuries later it survives not as evidence but as stain, a lingering shadow that no amount of historical debunking can quite erase. And this tells us more about Rome than it does about Nero, because in a society where power was absolute yet precarious, character assassination was the ultimate blood sport, and a well-placed rumor could do what armies could not. So we remember Nero not only for his brutal reign, but also for the whispers, for the insinuations that his mother was not just a political partner, but a lover, a story concocted to humiliate and undermine, and one that worked so well that it became embedded in the myth of his reign, a reminder that history is as much about what people chose to believe as it is about what actually happened, and that sometimes the most enduring legacies are born not of deeds, but of rumors whispered into eternity. History, when you peel away the marble and the pomp, has a nasty habit of reminding us that empires are often less about soaring ideals and more about the very human messiness of their rulers. And nowhere is this truer than in Rome, where the private lives of emperors served as both gossip fodder and political currency, their bedrooms and banquet halls functioning as miniature theaters in which the grand drama of the empire was rehearsed. Consider Julius Caesar, a man who could bend legions to his will and redraw the map of Europe, yet whose reputation was forever haunted not by lost battles, but by a particularly persistent whisper that he once played the passive role with King Nicomedes of Bithynia, a charge so deliciously scandalous that even his military conquests could not wash it away, proving that Roman society, for all its brutality and grandeur, was also terminally obsessed with roles, dominance, and the ever-slippery question of masculinity. Or take Hadrian, the bearded architect-emperor who spent less time conquering than redesigning the empire to his aesthetic liking, and whose grand passion was not his politically convenient wife, but the beautiful youth Antinous, a companion whose mysterious drowning in the Nile sparked not quiet mourning, but an imperial cult, complete with statues, temples, and even a city, Antinopolis, all dedicated to the boy's memory, a spectacle that left Rome stunned, divided, and perhaps a little jealous that love could be immortalized so extravagantly. Then there was Nero, Rome's eternal punchline, a man as addicted to spectacle as he was to cruelty, who, when not fiddling through fires or debuting his dubious talents on stage, decided to marry men twice, first donning a bridal veil to wed his freedman Pythagoras, then recasting the script by marrying the castrated boy Sporus, theatrically shoving his personal fantasies into the face of a public already choking on his excesses, reminding us that in Rome, the emperor was not merely a ruler, but the empire's most dangerous performance artist. And let us not forget Tiberius, sour and sullen, retreating to Capri with his entourage of youths, spawning rumors so lurid that later historians couldn't resist turning him into a caricature of decrepit debauchery. Proof that when emperors hid from the spotlight, the imagination of Rome happily filled in the gaps with tales darker and more entertaining than any truth could be. Together, these stories reveal that the so-called private lives of emperors were never private at all, but integral to their power, woven into the fabric of Roman politics as surely as grain supplies and legions, because to the Romans, nothing was more devastating than undermining a man's dignity through sexual rumor or personal scandal, and nothing was more irresistible than the chance to retell it. The irony, of course, is that while Rome gave us aqueducts, law codes, and straight roads, it also left us with a library of tawdry anecdotes, because empires, for all their stone and steel, are remembered just as vividly for their human flaws. And perhaps that is why Rome endures in our imagination, not simply as a colossus of history, but as a mirror, reflecting our own fascination with the messy entanglement of sex, power, gossip, and the eternal theater of reputation. Scandal has always been history's favorite weapon, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Rome, where the legacy of emperors was shaped as much by whispers and accusations as by laws and battles. A truth that forces us to see that the so-called lessons of history are often really lessons in gossip, reputation, and political spin. Take Nero, for example, who remains a byword for decadence, not because most people can list his policies on taxation or urban renewal, but because the story of him fiddling while Rome burned, almost certainly invented long after the fact, was too irresistible to die, and so it endures, repeated by school teachers and tour guides as though it were gospel. Or consider Tiberius, a man who ruled for 2 decades with considerable stability, yet whose retreat to Capri spawned lurid tales of depravity written gleefully by historians who disliked him and understood that nothing stains a man's reputation faster than rumors of unchecked lust. Even Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of rhetoric, and a figure of undeniable brilliance, could not escape the shadow of scandal, forever remembered by some as the Queen of Bithynia, thanks to graffiti and jokes about his alleged submissiveness with King Nicomedes, proving that in Rome, a whisper about what you did in bed could undo the glory of what you did on the battlefield. Hadrian's love for Antinous, meanwhile, though wrapped in tragedy, became equally a political scandal of sorts, because his decision to deify a young man for whom he openly grieved blurred the boundary between private sorrow and public cult, leaving contemporaries baffled as much as inspired, and reminding us that even sincere devotion could be interpreted as a breach of Roman norms. What these stories show is that the Romans, masters of conquest and law, were also masters of rumor as a political tool, understanding that if you wanted to topple a rival, you didn't always need an army. Sometimes a salacious accusation would do the job far more effectively, echoing through taverns, Senate debates, and history books for centuries. The lesson, then, is that reputations are fragile, and history is merciless in preserving not the nuance of a reign, but the caricature, not the reform, but the rumor, not the truth, but the tale that best entertains. And this should give us pause when we think about how our own leaders will be remembered, because the Roman pattern suggests it will not be for their infrastructure bills or carefully worded treaties, but for the scandals, real or imagined, that capture the imagination of their age. In the end, the enduring legacy of Rome's emperors is not just aqueducts and roads, but the reminder that power makes you vulnerable not only to daggers, but to whispers, and that long after marble crumbles, scandal remains, retold and reshaped by every generation hungry for drama, turning once-living rulers into characters in a never-ending play where the loudest accusation always wins.